Well, good morning to you. So glad that you are here. We're continuing in our journey through the book of Ephesians this summer, and we're continuing that journey of discovering how we should live, right? Chapters 4 through 6, in light of who we are. It begins with who we are, our identity, detailed to us in chapters 1 through 3. But to be honest with you, I got to be upfront with you, I was a little bit uneasy when I was given this passage to preach today in Ephesians, partly because it was only 3 months ago, just 13 weeks, 91 days if you want to be exact, that I preached a sermon on this exact passage here. And I know that, preachers will sometimes repeat themes and passages and even whole sermons. They'll just bring out the notes and preach the exact same sermon. But there's almost always more than 3 months from when they last. So we got to give you a little bit more time to forget what was said. So I was feeling a little bit uneasy. I'm like, boy, how do I preach the same passage again? This is going to be weird. But then I remembered a few things, right? First, I remember that God's words are living and active, and they will have new meaning for us today. All right, so same passage we looked at 3 months ago, but it will have new meaning for us today. And I also remembered that we did not come close to exhausting the truth in this passage in just one sermon, all right? So let's not overestimate my abilities there, right? There is more than we can bring out in just one message. And so I know there's going to be truth for us to discover here. There's going to be new meaning for us here. And if you were here 3 months ago, May 6th was the date. Just relax. This is a different message. I have a different set of notes here, okay? If you weren't here, then you're like, I don't really care. What's this guy talking about? I hope that you'll go to our app, go to our website, and listen to that message. It was all about, how do we submit to one another in marriage out of our reverence for Christ, how Jesus compels us to submit to one another. So you can catch up if you missed that one or any of the messages that we have archived there. It would be worth your time. Now, we're still focused in the realm of marriage today, all right? So we're not on a totally different subject from May 6th, but we are looking at it differently. And I want us to begin by taking a big step backwards, all right? Let's step back and ask a very fundamental, basic question about marriage. Why do we get married? Why do we, not why did you marry the person you married? That's your problem, right? Just why do we get married in the first place? Why do we have marriage? I don't know if you ever thought about it. I think it's a pretty good question to ponder. You just think about creation, the rest of God's creation. No other part of creation gets married, right? There aren't little turtle weddings with a penguin there officiating it or anything like that. No other part of creation gets married. So why do we get married? Some would say, well, it's for, be fruitful, multiply, procreate, the species and all that good stuff. But that just doesn't cut it for me because the animal kingdom's got that covered pretty well, and they're not getting married, right? And we all know people that have kids without getting married, so it can work without being married. So I don't think that is a part so much of why we have marriage and why we get married. But we should acknowledge from the very beginning that God established marriage. We have marriage because God started it. Right? And as we look at the creation account in Genesis 2, just after Eve was created, it says this in verse 23. The man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." He's united to his wife. They become one flesh. We don't know how, what kind of form or function that took, whether there was a ceremony for Adam and Eve, maybe they just shook hands, or we don't know how they came together. But from the very beginning, the concept of the marriage relationship was part of God's intent and design. Now, it's fascinating to me to kind of study the way marriages and weddings have changed throughout the centuries and how they vary from place to place. Depending on where you are in the world, you get married differently, right? And most of our weddings are pretty predictable. You walk down the aisle, there's a wedding party, pastor usually gives a message, they kiss, and then they go out and then we eat food, right? The biggest innovation is dancing up and down the aisles, and thankfully that started after I got married, so no one had to see me dancing up and down the aisles. But there are some really interesting and unique marriage and wedding customs around the world. I did some Googling on that. I'll share a couple with you. In Congo, I read that if you're getting married, right, you're the wedding couple, you are not allowed to smile at all on your wedding day because marriage is serious business. And if you're smiling and laughing, then you are not taking things seriously enough. So there should be no smiling, right? You can imagine looking through their photo album. You're like, wow, this is depressing. No one's happy here, right? And so no smiling in Congo. In Fiji, this was the most impressive to me. In Fiji, if a man wants to marry a woman, he has to ask her father's permission. Good for him, right? But to do that, he has to present the father with a whale's tooth. I'm like, whales have teeth? I never thought about this, right? But that's a whale's tooth. Some of them are huge. And then I'm thinking, what about the poor guy who can't find one laying around? Like he's swimming and he's swimming. Like, there's no whale's tooth, but there's a whale. I could take a tooth, right? And if you could take a whale's tooth from a whale, I think you get to marry whoever you want. That should be the rule. Like if you pulled it out, then you get whoever you want. Now, I find that stuff pretty interesting. Maybe I'm the only one here. I don't know. But this is not answering the question we're asking today. Why do we get married? The philosophy of getting married, the means of it, kind of the whole customs, and those change from based on time and based on location. But the intent of God's design has never changed. One man, one woman coming together in a unique, special relationship. God instituted this. God designed it, but why did he design it that way? There are many reasons we get married. There's many reasons, many benefits to the way that God has designed marriage. But there is one highest reason, biggest reason that I want us to consider this morning. And we find it in our passage, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. And we find that the highest purpose of marriage is to reflect an image of God. That the way we do married life, as followers of Jesus, the way we do married life should make a lost world curious about God. Look at verse 32 with me in chapter 5. It says, "This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church." Now, this verse seems out of place. It's towards the end of a passage giving instructions to husbands and wives. Husbands do this and this and this. Wives do this and this. And in that context, it says, all right, this is a weird part. This is really all about Jesus and the church. Now, marriage has always reflected God in some ways, whether we know it or not. But the way that we do married life as followers of Jesus, following the teachings and passages like this one, heightens that and clarifies that image of God in a whole new way. Our identity given to us by our trust in Jesus and developed in us by the work of his Spirit in us calls us to do married life in such a way that we clearly reflect what God is like to a world that needs to know him, and we reflect how we can relate to him. Now, I know that there are a number of people here who are not married. You're single, right? And you may be thinking, great, another sermon on marriage. I'm just going to doodle. Maybe I'll play connect the dots on my phone, whatever it may be, and then, I'll just get through this. But I hope that you will fight that temptation, that you will not put that wall up. Because although the principal context of this passage, of these verses, is marriage, and we're going to use marriage language a lot, God's truth is applicable to all of us, right? And God has information and truth for all of our relationships here. And it would be a shame to miss what God has for you today as a single person if you just said, well, this is not for me because I'm not married. Right? But God is speaking to where you're at in life as well. And I know that he will impress on you how you are just as much a reflection of his character and his person to the world around him. So listen past the marriage language and hear God's truth for your life as a single person as well. And I hope that we can all do that. So let's answer this question. Why do we get married? Why do we have marriage? And why did God design it this way? First, in this passage, we see that we get married so that we can reflect a picture of what God is like. In our marriages, we reflect a picture of what God is like, and the world will see that reflection of the creator and the designer of marriage. One thing that we reflect about God is his covenant nature, that God is a God of covenants. Being covenantal in nature is one of the things that sets God apart, separate from all other religious systems that I'm aware of. A covenant is a formal agreement, but it differs from a contract, right? A contract can be broken. If one party fails to do their end of the bargain, to uphold their end of the contract, then that contract is done. It's voided. But a covenant says, I will uphold my end of the covenant even if you fail to uphold your end of the covenant. The Bible records multiple covenants that God has made with mankind. We go all the way back to the beginning. God is showing his covenant nature as he deals with Adam and Eve after they have sinned, after they rebelled against him. And he's telling them, hey, here's all the bad news. Here's all the consequence of your sin. You really messed up. But here's the good news. I promise I make a covenant to fix this. And one day I'm going to send someone who will repair all of the brokenness, who will fix what you have done. And God makes a covenant in those initial moments. And then later on, he makes a covenant with Noah. Things had gotten so bad between Adam and Noah that God said, this is terrible. I've got to hit the reset button. I'm going to destroy all life except Noah and his family. Noah, build a boat. Let's get this done. And after the flood, he makes a covenant with Noah, and he says, I will never again destroy life on earth with a flood. And he makes this promise, a covenant. And then God begins making covenants with a certain group of people. And it begins with covenants that he made with a man named Abraham. He says, Abraham, I'm going to make you the beginning of a nation, that your descendants will become a great nation. We call them Israel, or the Jewish people now. And God made this promise and covenant with Abraham, and he said, I promise you this portion of land. And he gave them a land for their homeland. And he made this promise. Go forward, and he makes another covenant through Moses with Abraham's descendants, the nation of Israel. And he said, here are the laws and the regulations that you should follow, and here's what I will do as your God, and here's what you will do as my people. And he made this covenant through Moses. And then he makes another covenant with the nation of Israel, with King David. And he says, David, I promise you, I make a covenant that your line will sit on the throne of Israel forever. God is making covenant after covenant after covenant. And then he makes a new covenant with all of humanity again. And it's the fulfillment of the covenant that he made with Abraham. Because in Jesus, we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins for all who trust in him. And Jesus is repairing and restoring everything that has been broken by our sin. God is a God who makes covenants with humanity. He doesn't see us with the indifference that man-made gods exhibit. We do not exist for his amusement like a child with a bug in a jar. He doesn't walk away and abandon us when we fail to uphold our end of the covenant. He is faithful and trustworthy, and he will always do as he has promised. And when we understand that our marriages are a covenant, not a contract, then we are reflecting God's covenant nature with mankind. When we treat that marriage covenant with the highest priority, we are reflecting the value that God places on his covenants with us. And when we are faithful to do as we have promised in the covenant, even when our spouse fails, then we reflect God's faithfulness to keep his covenant with us. And when we live out our marriages as a covenant, then the world will be curious about God. And they'll wonder, where did you learn to live like that and to think like that? Another aspect of God that we reflect in marriage is his unconditional love. In Ephesians 5, this shows up in verse 25, where it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Now, this passage doesn't go into much detail about what, love means and how do we understand, how am I supposed to love? And so we can look to other passages that use this same Greek word for love to understand what it means more. And one of the greatest passages on this type of love is found in 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7. And it describes love this way. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. This is a daunting description of love and how we are called to love our spouse. I know I fall short of this more than I should. And this goes so far above and beyond, kind of the love-struck eyes and poetic words to express our deepest feelings for our spouse. And like many things in the Christian life, this level of love is not normal to us. It is not natural to us. It's not even in us until we place our trust in Jesus and His Spirit is given to us. And then we can express this kind of love because it's God's love. And it only originates from God. And so we can only then express this love and extend this love to others when we have God in our lives through our trust in Jesus. If we excel in romantic love in our marriages and our relationships, people might see that and they might be inspired and they would think, boy, I should be more romantic. I should really pour on the romance. I'm going to get some flowers on the way home. All right? That's a good thing. If we excel in more of a nurturing love where we really care for and nurture our spouse, someone might see that and think, wow, gosh, man, that is really great. I bet my spouse would love for me to treat them more like that. I should do that. I'm going to care for them more, nurture them more. And that would be good. But if we excel in this godly love, this love that flows from God, others will see that and they will think, what is that? Where did that come from? I don't know if I've ever experienced love like that, and I don't know how to love like that. Where did that person learn to love like that, and act like that, and think like that? And they will be curious about God. A third aspect of God that we reflect in marriage is His self-sacrificing nature. Look again at verse 25 with me. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. The God of the Bible is a tremendously self-sacrificing God. If we go all the way back to the Garden of Eden and that intentional nosedive into sin and rebellion that Adam and Eve took, ruining everything, God could have just walked away. He could have said, that's it, I'm out. I'm just going to obliterate everything. It'll be like they never existed. And our continued existence as a species is an ongoing exercise of self-sacrifice by God, because we continually, daily assault Him with sin and rebellion. And implementing His plan to redeem us, to fix what we've broken, is an example of utmost self-sacrifice, because God in Jesus took on all of our guilt, all of our shame, and instead gave us His holiness and His purity. No other major religious system has a self-sacrificing God like this at its core. Now, people can be self-sacrificing and they can do good without God in their lives, right? We know people, we work with them, we live with them, they're across the street. You're like, yeah, they're good people. They don't know Jesus, but they're good. They do some things. And it's kind of like, a broken clock can be right twice a day. Because we're all created in the image of God. We all bear God's image, whether we know that or not, whether we exhibit a relationship with God or not. We have that image. And so we can, even occasionally without Jesus, be self-sacrificing and do good. But when we are consistently self-sacrificing, when we have the vision to consistently give ourselves away to our spouse, we are exhibiting something so much more than just a residual imprint of God. Because as followers of Jesus, we have His Spirit with us and in us, and that calls us and compels us to live differently. When we are self-sacrificing, the world will be curious to know why we act that way. Why do you treat your wife or your husband that way? I don't get it. One last aspect of God that we reflect in our marriages is His nurturing nature. Verse 25 tells us that Jesus loved the church, gave Himself up for the church, but to what end? What was His reasoning? Look at verse 26 and 7. It says, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with the water through the word, and to present her to Himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. Because God's nature is self-sacrificing, His motivation for redeeming us and rescuing us out of our sin is for our good. He gave Himself up so that we can be made pure and holy and blameless. Now, in one sense, that transition happens instantly. The moment that we trust Jesus, our status, our standing, our position before God changes. In that moment, we go from sinful to sinless. We're changed from filthy and to pure. And we go from dead spiritually to alive in Jesus. And that happens in a moment. But we also live in a reality where we don't necessarily experience what's positionally true of us. That's called positional holiness, that our position with God has changed, but our experience, daily experience, doesn't always match that, and we experience that persistent presence of sin in our lives. And in those moments where we don't fully experience in our daily lives what God says is positionally true of us, He says you are holy, and you say, yeah, but I know what I did yesterday. Right? In those moments where we feel that tension, we encounter God's nurturing nature. And verses like Philippians 1:6 give us such great hope, where it says, He, that's God, who began a good work in you, will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ. That God has begun a good work in us, and He will nurture that good work, and He will develop it, and He will grow it, and expand it ever more in our lives until we stand before Him in Jesus Christ, and that work will be completed. And in that moment, when we stand before God, we will experience all the fullness of what has been true from us since we trusted Jesus. We will be fully alive. We will be fully sinless. We will be pure and holy in our experience, not just our position. And when we nurture our spouse, when we invest in helping him or her grow and develop, when we lift them up to a higher level, when we help them become more than they could be on their own, we reflect God's nurturing nature and how He is working in humanity. All that we, as followers of Jesus, have received from God should compel us. It should drive us to extend that nurturing nature to our spouses as well. And when the world sees these things in action, when they observe our marriages and they see that we treat it like a covenant, when they see that there is unconditional love and there's self-sacrificing with one another, and there's this nurturing love for one another, they'll see that, and they will see the reflection of a hope and a promise of a God who loves them no matter what, and who has given everything for them and will help them grow into something more than they could ever be on their own. And they will be curious to know God. Well, that's what we reflect about who God is. But there's also the sense that we reflect a picture of how we relate to God. We get married so that people can see how a picture of how to relate to God through our marriages. In verses 21 through 24, there's 3 ways that our marriages reflect to the world how that we relate to God. Look at the verses with me. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, His body, of which He is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Now, these are not everyone's favorite verses in the Bible, right? I get that. And, when we start hearing this word submit, this person submit to that person, we can get a little bit ruffled. But if we get caught up in who is told to submit to whom, we miss the bigger picture. Remember, verse 32, this is about Jesus and the church. The ideal of submission in marriage has nothing to do with, which gender is smarter and who is braver, who is stronger, who's taller. It has nothing to do with any of that. This is all about reflecting a picture of how we relate to God. And in these verses, there's 3 reflections of relating to God. 2 of them are more implicit, all right? So we'll have to look at some other scriptures, but one is very clear, and we'll start with that one. That when we're doing married life God's way, we reflect a posture, a picture of submitting to God, right? And we heard that word many times in there, submit, submit, submit. It's inherent in our humanity to fight submission. That's why we kind of get ruffled about it. We fight submission. Every fiber in our being, because of our sin and brokenness, screams and struggles to run our own lives. That attitude of I want to do what I want to do is at the center, is at the core of every sinful, broken thing in this world. And we struggle with submission because we bring a stubborn, stiff-necked self-determination into our marriages. And we bring all of that into our interactions with God. We interact stubbornly with God. But a relationship with God has to begin with a posture of submission. We have to submit to God. And as we submit to one another in our marriage, the world sees a reflection of what it means to submit to God and to yield to Him. And then this act of submission reveals the other two postures, all right, that are kind of implied in this. And so we want to look at some other scriptures. But when we submit, we're also demonstrating and we're developing humility. Submission requires humility. Now, humility can either be embraced willingly or it can be forced upon you, right? I don't know if you've ever been in a wrestling match with an older brother who's better, stronger, and you know that feeling of forced humility as you lay there with your face stuffed into the carpet and you're like, help, help, right? And so you know this feeling. Our relationship, our relating to God must begin with humility. And the willing version of humility is so much better than that forced version. Look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 6. It says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Now, there will be occasions when God humbles a person, when He forces humility on someone, right, in order to accomplish something in their lives. But you'll find that always follows or comes when a person has ignored every opportunity to humble themselves and to submit to God. In our marriages, we are called to reflect to people a willing humility and to practice this willing humility as we submit to one another. And submission requires, because when the world sees this, they see an example. They see an example of what it looks like to be willingly humble and submit to someone else. So submission requires humility. And then lastly, it creates dependence. When we are submitting, we are putting ourselves in a place of dependence. That when we submit to someone, we're putting ourselves under their care. We are dependent on them and their leadership and their direction and their provision and their love for us. When we submit to one another in our marriages, we create dependence on our spouse for these things. And we do that so that we can reflect a picture of what it means to depend on God. We make ourselves vulnerable. We put ourselves in a position of dependence on another person so that the world can see what it means to depend on God. Humanity in general has a fiercely independent streak, and the world needs to see examples of people submitting to one another in humility and dependence so that they can understand and they can see what it means to relate to God that way. So why do we get married? There are a lot of good reasons to get married, and there's some not so good reasons to get married. But there's one highest reason, one greatest purpose for marriage, and that is to reflect a picture of what God is like and how we as people can relate to Him. So as you think about your marriage today or your upcoming marriage or your significant relationships in your life, let's not begin by asking, is this fulfilling to me? Does this relationship add meaning to my life? Let's first ask, is this relationship rightly reflecting what God is like? Am I reflecting very clearly how people relate to God? Or am I making things cloudy? I hope you'll take the sermon notes that theoretically you filled in, and that you'll be able to read through them in the coming weeks and to reflect on that and to meditate on that and to say, God, where's my weak link? Where is the reflection, your reflection, the weakest in my marriage or in this relationship? And talk to your spouse about that and say, how do we make this better? How do we increase this? How do we clarify the reflection of God in this area and commit it to prayer? Not just a one-off, but make it a matter of prayer as a couple. God, how do we grow? Teach us how to better reflect you through our marriage. I was reminded this morning, just as I talked with some different people, that some marriages are in extraordinary circumstances. And they're in a deep, deep hole, if you will, whether it's because of unexpected medical issues or damage that has been done to the relationship, and you're wondering, like, is this even repairable? Have we so ruined our marriage that God is totally lost and there is no reflection of him? I know that there is no irredeemable situation. And we may not understand how it's going to work out, and it may not ever go back to the way it was, but God can bring his image and his glory out of any circumstance. And so maybe your prayer, if you're in that place where you're like, we think we blew it, there is no image of God in our relationship, then maybe your prayer is, God, show us, how do we redeem anything from this? How do we move forward? Because God always takes us where we are and shows us a path forward in his grace and in his power and ability. And so maybe that is your prayer today. God, how do I redeem anything out of this situation? Teach me. And we can all pray, because we all have at least one way that we are not fully reflecting God in our marriages, in our relationships. God, teach me how to better reflect you. A couple of resources that may be helpful to you. One is a book by Paul Tripp called What Did You Expect? Redeeming the Realities of Marriage. And we used this material for a marriage weekend several months ago in part of that marriage series. And it is tremendous. It has so much powerful truth and lessons for our marriages in the book, in the material. It will strengthen your marriage, and it will help you better reflect God to the world around you. It'd be a great book to pick up and read. If you're thinking more, hey, I'd love to experience, give me an experience. I don't want to read a book. Maybe check out A Weekend to Remember that's hosted by Family Life Ministries. I know they've got several coming up in our general area this fall, and they are really, really good weekends where you can invest in your marriage and you can grow closer together and you can better reflect God's person, his character, and how we relate to him with a stronger marriage. And so those would be a couple resources we would recommend to you, because our marriages have a high calling. There is more at stake than our fulfillment and, a great family and a great community and this species and all that. There's more at stake than that as we reflect what God is like, who God is to the world around us. So let's become the clearest, brightest reflection of God that we can be to a world that is lost and dying and desperate to know him. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your grace. God, thank you for all that you've given us. God, we're grateful that you have given us marriage. It adds so much to our lives. But God, don't let us forget that the highest calling, the highest purpose of our marriage is to reflect you to those who are lost and dying without you. God, we pray that you would help us, because we mess things up all the time. And we are not good reflections of you. And Father, we don't even know how to do better. Will you teach us? Will you show us how we can be better, how we can grow? Because you are nurturing us, and you've sacrificed so much for us, and you love us unconditionally, and you are faithful, and you will make this thing happen, God. So we submit to you, we yield to you, and we just throw our hands up and say, we need your help. We don't know how to do this. Make our marriages a bright, shining example of what you are like, that the gospel can shine clearly through us. God, I do pray for any marriage here that is in a deep hole, for maybe it's an external reason like illness or finances. Maybe there's been damage done to the relationship by some means or another, and people are wondering, is there any God left in my marriage? Father, I pray that you would meet them where they're at, that you would fill them with your Spirit, fill them with the hope that you are never done working on us, and show them the way forward. Show them the next step in your love and your affirmation of them. God, we're so grateful for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen.